How did you meet the partner who turned your life upside down, for better or worse? I met my soulmate at my grandfather's funeral while ugly crying into a box of tissues, and he was the only person who didn't try to console me with empty platitudes. What I didn't know was that his family was the reason my grandfather was dead. I, 26F, think I'm losing my mind. I can see all the ways I was complicit in my own deception. I made excuses for red flags because I was desperate for someone to understand my pain. I was part of the problem from day one. My grandfather Luis raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 7. He was this tough, weathered man who worked construction his whole life, but would sit with me for hours helping with homework and teaching me to draw. When other kids had soccer moms, I had a grandfather who showed up to every school event in his work boots, dirt still under his fingernails, beaming with pride. He was my entire world. The accident happened on a Tuesday in March. Scaffolding collapse at a job site downtown. Luis was 68 and should have retired years ago, but he loved working with his hands too much to stop. The call came while I was in a client meeting, some corporate logo redesign that felt meaningless the second I heard my grandfather was in the hospital. By the time I got there, he was already gone. The funeral was exactly what Luis would have wanted. No fuss, just the people who mattered. Mostly other construction workers, neighbors from his block, a few cousins I barely knew. I sat in the front pew feeling completely hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell. That's when I noticed him. Ajax was sitting 3 rows back, wearing a black suit that looked expensive but not flashy. Dark hair, olive skin, maybe late 20s. He had this way of sitting perfectly still while everyone else fidgeted or whispered. What struck me most was his face. He looked genuinely devastated. Not the polite sadness you see at funerals of people you barely knew, but real grief. During the service, while the priest talked about Luis's devotion to family and honest work, I kept glancing back at this stranger who seemed to be mourning my grandfather as deeply as I was. When I started crying, the ugly, shoulder-shaking kind that you can't control, Ajax was the only person who didn't look away or offer tissues or try to comfort me. He just watched with this understanding in his eyes, like he knew exactly what I was feeling. After the burial, everyone gathered at Luis's house for food and stories. I was going through the motions, accepting condolences and pretending to eat the casseroles neighbors had brought, when Ajax approached me in the kitchen. Instead of the usual, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "he's in a better place now," Ajax said something that stopped me cold. He told me that losing someone who raised you felt like losing your foundation and your future at the same time. That the world suddenly felt unsafe because the person who made it make sense was gone. I stared at this stranger who had just described exactly what I couldn't put into words. He introduced himself as Ajax Morales, said he worked in legal aid helping construction workers with workplace issues. He'd known my grandfather through his advocacy work, helping older workers understand their rights. I see how perfectly crafted that introduction was. How it explained his presence at the funeral, while positioning him as someone who cared about people like Luis. I was so desperate for someone to understand my loss that I didn't question why a legal aid lawyer would be personally devastated by one client's death. We talked for 2 hours. Ajax listened while I shared stories about Luis teaching me to use power tools in his garage, how he'd pack elaborate lunches for my school trips, how he called me his little artist, and kept every drawing I'd ever made pinned to his refrigerator. Ajax shared his own experiences with loss, talked about his grandmother who'd raised him after his mother left, how grief changes shape but never really goes away. When the last guest left and I was alone cleaning up paper plates and empty casserole dishes, Ajax stayed to help. He didn't ask if I needed help or wait to be invited. He just quietly started washing dishes while I sat at Luis's kitchen table, too emotionally drained to move. Before he left, Ajax wrote his number on a piece of paper and left it next to my purse. He didn't ask me to call or suggest we get coffee sometime. He just said that if I ever wanted to talk to someone who understood what I was going through, he'd be there. I called him 3 days later. We met for coffee at a quiet place downtown, and Ajax listened while I cried into my latte about how empty Luis's house felt, how I couldn't bring myself to pack up his things, how everyone expected me to move forward when I felt frozen in place. Ajax didn't offer solutions or empty reassurances. He just sat with me in my grief in a way that felt like coming home. Ajax became my lifeline through those first impossible weeks. He'd text me good morning every day, not with motivational quotes or forced positivity, but just to let me know he was thinking of me. 3 weeks after the funeral, Ajax kissed me for the first time in Luis's garage, surrounded by the sawhorses and half-finished projects my grandfather would never complete. It felt like the first real thing I'd experienced since losing him. I thought I'd found someone who truly understood me. Someone who could love me through the worst thing that had ever happened to me. 6 weeks into dating Ajax, the first crack in my perfect grief story appeared, and I was so desperate to keep feeling understood that I painted over it like it never happened. Ajax and I had settled into this routine, where he'd come over after work and we'd order takeout, while I slowly went through Luis's belongings. It felt healing, having someone witness my memories without trying to rush me through the process. Ajax would hold up Luis's old work shirts and listen to me explain which job sites they were from, or flip through photo albums while I told stories about every Christmas and birthday. One evening, I was showing Ajax a box of Luis's work documents, safety certifications, union cards, job completion certificates. Ajax was unusually quiet as I sorted through the paperwork, occasionally asking questions about dates or project locations. Then I pulled out the incident report from the accident. I'd only skimmed it at the hospital, too devastated to process the details. But now, with Ajax's steady presence beside me, I felt strong enough to read through it properly. The report described how the scaffolding had collapsed during routine maintenance work on a downtown office building. Multiple safety violations were noted: improper installation, missing support brackets, failure to follow OSHA guidelines. Luis had been working on the third level when the entire structure gave way. I read aloud, and Ajax's body language shifted. He started fidgeting with his coffee cup, checking his phone, clearing his throat in that way people do when they're uncomfortable. When I mentioned the building address, Ajax went completely still. Then he said something that should have been a massive red flag. He knew the building, knew it intimately, actually, described the lobby layout, the security setup, even mentioned that the elevators were being upgraded. I asked how he knew so much about a random downtown office building. Ajax explained that his legal aid office had worked with several construction companies in that area, helping workers navigate disputes and safety complaints. He'd been in that particular building multiple times for meetings with management. It made perfect sense. Of course, a legal advocate for construction workers would be familiar with major job sites. I was being paranoid for no reason, but something about his tone felt off. Ajax explained the building details with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been there dozens of times, not the professional knowledge of someone who'd had a few work meetings there. And the timing felt weird. Why would he have been meeting with building management if he represented workers? 2 weeks later, the second incident happened. I'd been having trouble sleeping, replaying the accident details in my mind, wondering if Luis suffered or if it was quick. Ajax suggested I might benefit from talking to someone who'd been at the scene, maybe get some closure by understanding exactly what happened. I told him I'd been thinking the same thing, but didn't know how to find witnesses or first responders. Ajax offered to help. He had connections in the legal community, knew investigators who specialized in workplace accidents. He could make some calls, see what he could find out. The offer felt incredibly generous. Ajax was willing to use his professional network to help me process my grief, even though it meant potentially triggering his own trauma around workplace safety issues. It proved how much he cared about my healing. 3 days later, Ajax called with information. He'd spoken to someone who'd been at the scene, an inspector who arrived just after the collapse. According to this contact, the accident had been quick. Luis probably lost consciousness immediately from the impact. He wouldn't have suffered. For months, I'd been haunted by images of Luis trapped and afraid, calling for help that never came. Knowing he hadn't experienced prolonged pain felt like a gift Ajax had given me. But later, lying in bed while Ajax slept beside me, something nagged at me about the conversation. How had Ajax found this specific inspector so quickly? How did he know exactly which questions to ask to get the details I needed to hear? Most importantly, why was this inspector willing to share confidential information about an ongoing investigation with a random legal aid lawyer? Ajax had presented the information as a favor from a professional contact, but it felt more personal than that, like he hadn't called around asking for help, like he'd called someone who already knew the answers. The third incident happened during a dinner conversation about my future plans. I'd been struggling with whether to stay in the city where everything reminded me of Luis, or start fresh somewhere else. Ajax listened while I weighed the pros and cons, offering thoughtful insights about grief and the importance of community during difficult times. I mentioned that part of me wanted to understand more about what had happened to Luis, not just the basic accident details, but the deeper context. Why had the safety violations occurred? Who was responsible for oversight? Was this part of a pattern of negligence that put other workers at risk? Ajax's face changed. The supportive, encouraging expression I'd grown used to shifted into something more guarded. He started talking about the dangers of getting too involved in legal investigations, how pursuing answers about workplace accidents could be emotionally damaging for family members. He suggested that sometimes the healthiest thing was to accept what happened and focus on moving forward. The conversation felt different from his usual approach to my grief. Instead of sitting with my feelings and validating my need to process them, Ajax was actively discouraging me from exploring this particular aspect of my loss. He was steering me away from questions about accountability and responsibility. When I pressed him about why he thought investigating would be harmful, Ajax got more specific. He warned me about getting tangled up with lawyers and investigators who might take advantage of my vulnerability. Everything he said sounded reasonable and caring. Ajax was protecting me from additional trauma, using his professional experience to guide me away from a path that might cause more harm than healing. He was looking out for my best interests, but I noticed he never addressed my actual question about whether other workers might be at risk. Ajax focused entirely on my emotional well-being and completely ignored the possibility that preventing future accidents might be worth some temporary discomfort. It felt like he was trying to contain my curiosity rather than help me process it. I made excuses that perpetuated the dysfunction because facing the truth would have meant losing the one person who seemed to understand my pain. I chose the comfort of denial over the discomfort of reality, and that choice made me complicit in whatever Ajax was hiding. 3 months after Luis's funeral, I made the decision that would unravel everything. The decision to investigate Luis's death didn't happen in a moment of clarity or strength. It happened because I was cleaning out his bedroom dresser and found something that made me feel sick with guilt about how passive I'd become in honoring his memory. Tucked between folded undershirts was a small notebook where Luis had been tracking safety violations at various job sites. Page after page of meticulous notes in his careful handwriting, missing guardrails, improperly secured scaffolding, supervisors who pressured workers to skip safety protocols to meet deadlines. The final entry was dated 2 days before his accident. Reading those notes, I realized I'd spent 3 months being comforted and consoled when I should have been fighting for answers. Luis had died because someone cut corners, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own grief to demand accountability. That night, I told Ajax about finding the notebook and my decision to look into the circumstances of the accident more thoroughly. His reaction was immediate and intense, not angry, but deeply concerned in a way that felt disproportionate to what I'd said. Ajax spent 20 minutes explaining why this was a bad idea. He talked about how workplace accident investigations were complex and emotionally draining, how families often spent years in legal battles that reopened wounds without delivering real closure. But I noticed he never acknowledged that Luis's death might have been preventable, never validated my anger about the safety violations, never suggested that fighting for accountability might honor Luis's memory, even if it didn't ease my pain. Ajax's entire focus was on managing my emotional response rather than supporting my need for answers. I compromised. I told Ajax I understood his concerns, but needed to at least gather some basic information about what had happened. Nothing dramatic or legally complex, just enough to understand the sequence of events and who was responsible. I promised to be careful about not getting overwhelmed by the details. Ajax's relief was palpable, but he insisted on helping with the research. He didn't want me going through this alone, potentially triggering myself with graphic details or legal jargon. He offered to use his professional contacts to get copies of the official reports, saving me the bureaucratic hassle of requesting documents myself. At the time, his offer felt incredibly supportive. Ajax was willing to potentially re-traumatize himself by diving into workplace safety issues because he cared about my need for closure. He was putting my healing ahead of his own comfort. Now I understand he was maintaining control over what information I accessed and how I interpreted it. The first documents Ajax brought me were exactly what I'd expected. Police reports, paramedic logs, basic incident summaries, everything confirmed what we already knew. Scaffolding collapse, multiple safety violations, Luis died on impact. The paperwork was clinical and devastating, but it didn't reveal anything new. Ajax sat beside me while I read through everything, offering tissues when I cried and explanations when I encountered unfamiliar terminology. He was patient and gentle, helping me understand the technical details without pushing me to move faster than I was emotionally ready for. But I started noticing gaps in the documentation. References to contractor reports that weren't included, mentions of OSHA investigations that seemed incomplete, citations of building permits and inspection records that weren't attached to the files Ajax had obtained. When I asked about the missing pieces, Ajax explained that different agencies maintained separate records, and getting comprehensive documentation would require requests to multiple departments. He offered to help with that process too, but warned me it could take weeks or months to get everything, and much of it would be technical information that wouldn't provide the closure I was looking for. 2 weeks later, I decided to start my own research. Not because I didn't trust Ajax, but because I needed to feel actively involved in understanding what had happened to Luis. I couldn't just passively receive information that someone else filtered and interpreted for me. I started with online searches about the construction company responsible for the job site. The name from the police report was Morrison & Associates General Contractors, a mid-sized company that had been operating in the city for 15 years. Their website showed completed projects, safety certifications, testimonials from satisfied clients. But digging deeper through news archives and public records, I found a different pattern. Morrison & Associates had been cited for safety violations on 12 different job sites over the past 5 years, 3 previous accidents resulting in worker injuries, 2 OSHA investigations that had resulted in significant fines. This wasn't a company with an isolated safety problem. This was a company with a documented pattern of cutting corners that put workers at risk. Luis's death wasn't a tragic accident. It was the predictable result of systematic negligence. The discovery that felt like a physical blow came when I found the building permits for the office complex where Luis died. The construction project had been a renovation and expansion, managed by Morrison & Associates, but overseen by a separate contracting company responsible for safety compliance and regulatory oversight. The oversight company was listed as Morales Construction, LLC. I stared at that name on my laptop screen for 5 full minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Morales Construction, LLC had been responsible for ensuring that safety protocols were followed on the job site where my grandfather died. They had been paid to prevent exactly the kind of accident that killed Luis. Ajax's last name was Morales. He'd never mentioned having family in construction, but surnames were common. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe there was no connection between Ajax and the company that had failed to protect my grandfather. I sat in Luis's house with my laptop open, surrounded by the tools and work clothes of a man who'd died because someone prioritized profits over safety, and realized I might have been sleeping next to someone connected to his death. The nausea was immediate and overwhelming. I ran to Luis's bathroom and threw up, then sat on the floor with my back against the bathtub, shaking. Morales Construction LLC was owned and operated by Ricardo Morales, age 54. The company had been subcontracted by Morrison and Associates to handle safety oversight and regulatory compliance on 7 different projects over the past 2 years, including the office building renovation where Luis died. Public records showed that Ajax Morales was listed as the registered agent for Morales Construction LLC. His signature was on multiple documents filed with the city. His name was on the business license, the insurance policies, the contractor bonds. Ajax wasn't just connected to the company responsible for the safety failures that killed my grandfather. He was legally and financially tied to every decision they made. The most sickening realization was that Ajax had probably been watching me from the beginning. He'd attended Luis's funeral not out of grief or guilty conscience, but as reconnaissance. He'd needed to assess what kind of threat I might pose to his family's company and had discovered I was too devastated to ask the right questions. So he'd made himself indispensable to my healing process, ensuring he could control what information I accessed and how I processed it. Every tender moment, every intimate conversation, every time he'd held me while I cried, it had all been strategic manipulation designed to protect his family's financial interests. The final piece of documentation I found was a settlement agreement between Morales Construction LLC and Morrison and Associates, dated 6 weeks after Luis's accident. The settlement absolved both companies of legal liability for the scaffolding collapse in exchange for implementing new safety protocols and paying an undisclosed fine to OSHA. Ajax's family company had negotiated their way out of responsibility for my grandfather's death while Ajax was holding my hand and helping me process my grief. They'd been covering their legal exposure while their son gathered intelligence about whether the victim's family was likely to pursue wrongful death litigation. Sitting in Luis's kitchen with printed copies of business licenses and settlement agreements spread across the table, I understood that every moment of comfort Ajax had provided had been contaminated by deception. The man I'd fallen in love with had been sent to manage the emotional fallout from his family's role in killing the person I loved most. I was part of the problem because I'd made it so easy for him. That night, I called Ajax and asked him to come over. I told him I'd found some information about the accident that I wanted to discuss with him. My voice was steady, almost casual. I'd gotten very good at hiding my real feelings from someone who'd been studying my emotional responses for months. He said he'd be right over, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Ajax was probably worried I'd discovered something that would upset me, something he'd need to help me process and contextualize. He had no idea I'd discovered everything. Ajax arrived 23 minutes after I called, carrying Thai food and wearing the same concerned expression he'd perfected over months of managing my emotional crises. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them to keep from giving myself away before I was ready. He kissed my forehead like he always did, asked how I was feeling, started unpacking containers of pad thai with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged in my space. The business documents were spread across Luis's dining room table, hidden under a tablecloth. I'd organized everything chronologically, like building a case, because that's what this had become. Ajax settled onto the couch and patted the cushion next to him, expecting me to curl up against his side like I had every night for 3 months. My voice came out smaller than I'd intended when I started speaking, but I forced myself to begin anyway, because Luis deserved better than my cowardice. I told Ajax I'd been doing more research about the accident, that I'd found some information that raised questions about the companies involved. Even knowing what I knew, some part of me was still hoping he'd have an explanation that would make this all make sense. Ajax's body language shifted immediately. He asked what kind of information I'd found, and his voice carried this careful neutrality that felt like a stranger speaking. I reached under the tablecloth and pulled out the first document, the business license for Morales Construction LLC with his signature at the bottom. I set it on the coffee table between us and watched Ajax's face change as he recognized what he was looking at. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Ajax stared at the document without touching it, and I could see him calculating something behind his eyes. He said my name like he was trying to explain something to a child who wouldn't understand. Then he started talking, and every word felt like another knife being twisted in wounds I didn't even know I had. Ajax told me he'd wanted to explain from the beginning but hadn't known how, that meeting me at the funeral had been accidental, but falling in love with me had been real, that he'd been trying to protect me from information that would only cause more pain without bringing Luis back, that everything between us had been genuine even though the circumstances were complicated. Ajax made it sound like he'd been caught between love and loyalty, like he'd been trying to do right by everyone involved, like his deception had been motivated by care rather than self-preservation. I asked him how long he'd known who I was before approaching me at the funeral. Ajax hesitated, and I could see him deciding how much truth he could afford to tell. He admitted he'd recognized Luis's name from the accident reports and had attended the service to assess whether the family was likely to pursue legal action. I asked if anything about our relationship had been real, if he'd ever actually cared about me, or if I'd just been a target from day one. My voice cracked on the question because some desperate part of me was still hoping he'd convince me that the love had been genuine, even if the circumstances were fake. Ajax moved from the couch to kneel in front of Luis's recliner, reaching for my hands with tears in his eyes. He swore that falling in love with me had been the most unexpected thing that had ever happened to him. That he'd started watching me to protect his family's business, but had stayed because I'd become the most important person in his world. Ajax had been planning to tell me the truth, only after ensuring I couldn't use it to hold his family accountable for Luis's death. He'd calculated exactly how long he needed to keep me controlled and compliant before he could afford to be honest. I pulled my hands away from his and asked about the settlement agreement I'd found. Ajax's face went pale, and I realized he hadn't known I'd discovered that document. He started explaining how the settlement wasn't an admission of guilt, but a practical business decision to avoid expensive litigation. I wanted to scream at him that my grandfather wasn't a learning opportunity or a catalyst for improvement. Instead, I asked the question that had been destroying me since I'd found the first document. I asked if Ajax had ever felt guilty about comforting me through grief his family had caused. Ajax started sobbing in a way that felt more genuine than anything else he'd said, admitting that the guilt had been eating him alive from the beginning, but he'd told himself that helping me heal was a form of making amends. The twisted logic of it made me feel sick. Ajax had convinced himself that manipulating me through my grief was actually a form of penance. I asked him what he'd planned to do if I'd discovered the truth on my own, like I had. Ajax went quiet for a long time, and I could see him debating whether to lie again or finally tell me something completely honest. He admitted that his father had been pressuring him to find ways to discredit me if I'd started asking dangerous questions. Ajax swore he'd refuse to do that, but I could see in his eyes that he'd at least considered it. I stood up from Luis's chair and walked to the dining room table, pulling away the tablecloth to reveal all the documents I'd printed. Business licenses, safety violation citations, settlement agreements, OSHA investigation reports. Ajax followed me and stared at the papers with this look of defeat that might have been relief. I told him I wanted him to explain every document. For the next hour, Ajax walked me through the business relationships and cost-cutting decisions that had led to the scaffolding collapse. He explained how his family's company had been hired to provide safety oversight, but had approved substandard materials and inadequate inspections to maintain profitability margins. Luis had died because Ajax's family had decided his life was worth less than their quarterly earnings. The scaffolding collapse hadn't been a tragic accident, but a predictable result of systematic negligence designed to maximize profits while minimizing safety expenditures. Ajax tried to contextualize everything in terms of industry standards and regulatory complexities, but I could hear the hollow defensiveness in his explanations. When he finished explaining, Ajax asked what I wanted to do with the information, whether I was planning to pursue legal action or go to the media, or just needed to understand what had happened for my own peace of mind. His voice carried this careful neutrality, like he was trying to assess the threat level while appearing supportive of whatever I decided. I realized he was still trying to manage me. Even in the moment of complete honesty, Ajax was calculating how to minimize damage to his family while maintaining some version of our relationship. I told him I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I needed him to leave Luis's house and not come back. Ajax started crying again, begging me not to make any permanent decisions while I was angry and hurt. He promised to give his family's attorneys my contact information if I wanted to discuss some kind of compensation for Luis's death. He offered to testify against his own father if I decided to pursue wrongful death litigation. But I'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and strategic positioning. Ajax wasn't offering to help me seek justice. He was offering to help me find a resolution that would allow us to stay together while minimizing consequences for his family. I walked to the front door and held it open until he understood I wasn't going to negotiate or compromise or give him more time to convince me that love could coexist with betrayal. Ajax gathered his things slowly, like he was hoping I'd change my mind before he reached the threshold. As he was leaving, Ajax turned back and said he understood why I needed space, but hoped I'd eventually realize that people could change and grow beyond their worst mistakes. I closed the door while he was still talking and turned the deadbolt with shaking hands. The next morning, I called Maria Santos, the lawyer who'd handled my grandfather's estate paperwork. I told her I'd discovered some information about Luis's accident that raised questions about wrongful death litigation. By the end of that week, I'd turned over every document I'd found to investigators who specialized in workplace safety violations and corporate negligence. Ajax's family would finally face consequences for prioritizing profits over worker safety. 3 months later, Morales Construction LLC was shut down by OSHA for systematic safety violations spanning 7 years and multiple job sites. Ricardo Morales was personally fined $2.3 million and banned from the construction industry. Morrison & Associates lost their contractor licenses and filed for bankruptcy protection. Ajax called me once during the investigation, asking if we could meet to discuss how the legal proceedings were affecting our relationship. I didn't return his call. Luis would have been proud that I finally fought for the justice he'd been trying to document in that notebook, that I'd chosen accountability over comfort, truth over the illusion of love. Update. For everyone asking if I regret pursuing the case, I don't. Luis died because people decided his safety wasn't worth protecting. Exposing that decision prevented other families from losing someone they loved to the same negligence. Ajax texted me 6 months later saying he'd moved to another state and hoped I'd found peace. I blocked his number without responding. Peace isn't something you find when someone hands it to you. It's something you build when you stop letting other people define what you deserve. Edit. Some people are saying Ajax really loved me and I was too harsh. Love doesn't require you to carry someone else's lies about your own trauma. If he'd loved me, he would have told me the truth and faced the consequences instead of using my grief to protect his family's business.